Allen Dulles gave permission for Sidney Gottlieb to use a fireboat to spray germs into the fog in San Francisco harbor. The point was to try to infect 800,000 people. Let's start during World War II. The Nazi government in Germany has made great use of scientists to develop different kinds of drugs. Believe it or not, the Nazis invented methamphetamine to try to create a German super soldier that could fight Russians on the Russian front and had no need to sleep. Well, those German scientists were brought to the United States after the Second World War in something called Operation Paperclip. They were given new identities, they were given new backgrounds, they were even given new names, jobs in the American government, homes in the Washington area, and they were told to keep working on whatever they were working on under the Nazis. That ended up being used by the nascent CIA. In 1947, the CIA was created with passage of the National Security Act. We all know that. But immediately, they began working with these Nazi doctors on the development of drugs. Well, at the same time, in Switzerland, a doctor developed a new drug called lysergic acid diethylamide 25, known as LSD. And immediately, the new CIA saw an opportunity. Keep in mind also something else. The CIA in those early days was obsessed with the idea of the Soviet Union or the newly communist Chinese by 1949 developing some kind of superdrug that could control the minds of men. They were afraid that the Soviets or the Chinese would develop this drug, would forcibly give it to an American soldier that perhaps they captured on the battlefield, and that they would be able to send that soldier back as something like what became known as a Manchurian candidate to infiltrate the US government, maybe even run for office and get elected. So there was this imaginary race between American scientists, many of them former Nazis, and what the CIA assumed was happening within the KGB, in the Soviet Union, and in Chinese intelligence. We'll never know if that was true. But that's what the thought was between 1947 and, frankly, as late as 1975. In 1951, there was a young scientist by the name of Sidney Gottlieb. Sidney Gottlieb was very bright, and he also happened to be Jewish. Now, that's important later on, because it was Sidney Gottlieb that ended up working with these former Nazi scientists to develop drugs for the CIA. Well, Sidney Gottlieb heard about this new LSD, and he heard that it could do incredible things. Doctors who were developing LSD in Switzerland were taking doses of it themselves. They were their own guinea pigs, so that they could see what it did. They could take notes while they were tripping out, and then take larger and larger doses until they could sort of get the right level. Well, they were talking about the room melting, blood coming out of the walls, people growing two heads. One Swiss scientist wrote in his notebook that his tape recorder turned into a dog and began to bark at him. So they knew that this LSD could do crazy things. It was psychotropic, like magic mushrooms, but they weren't quite sure how to tame it. Sidney Gottlieb heard about this and had an idea. And it was an idea, frankly, that he got from the Nazis. That idea was to experiment on human beings, whether they liked it or not. And he was going to do it all in the name of the CIA. Now, at the time, there was a fort in rural Maryland called Fort Detrick. It still exists today. And it's sort of the locale for the US military's experimentation with chemical weapons. But back then, in the late 1940s and the early 1950s, that's where the government did all of its experimentation with biological weapons. And that's where Sidney Gottlieb was stationed. So in the beginning, Sidney Gottlieb would take this newly synthesized LSD and give it to soldiers without them knowing about it. And then just observe them over the course of 3 days to see how long the trip lasted, whether it was a good trip or a bad trip, whether these soldiers were seeing flowers or seeing devils. and then try to figure out how to change the chemical structure of it so that that soldier could be controlled. Well, that was easier said than done. In 1950, Allen Dulles, who would later become the CIA director, was named the CIA's director of plans. That office no longer exists. It was really a euphemism for operations. Dulles was the deputy director for operations, then known as the director of plans. The crazy part of it is, he never told any of his supervisors that Sidney Gottlieb was working for him and that Sidney Gottlieb was working with LSD. He just kept it to himself. Why? Because he knew that he was going to be named CIA director eventually. And once he was director, he didn't have to tell anybody. 1950 and 1951 turned out to be pivotal years for this nascent program. In 1950, Director of Plans Allen Dulles created a program called MKNAOMI. MKNAOMI authorized the development of mind control drugs. MKNAOMI was the predecessor operation to MK Ultra. That's the famous one that everybody knows about, or they think they know about. Later on in 1950, in September of 1950, Allen Dulles approved of an operation under MKNAOMI that is going to sound absolutely unbelievable to you. Allen Dulles gave permission for Sidney Gottlieb to use a fireboat, right? One of those boats that has powerful hoses on it to put out maritime fires. He authorized Sidney Gottlieb to spray germs into the fog in San Francisco Harbor. The point was to try to infect 800,000 people in San Francisco with this germ just to see how many would get sick. And they thought that the germ would sit heavily in the fog and would linger in the air longer that way to infect more people. Now remember, nobody knew that this was happening. And I don't mean just nobody in San Francisco. I mean nobody. The CIA director didn't know it was happening. The president didn't know it was happening. This was Allen Dulles and Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. So what happened? They spray this poison into the air, and 11 people got identical urinary tract infections within the next 3 days. Now, we know that these were specific to the germ because these urinary tract infections included bleeding, but with blood that had crystals in it. Doctors were so taken aback by the fact that this wasn't just a urinary tract infection, but these people were discharging crystals from their bodies, that they actually got together in doctors' groups and talked about it. That what in the world is this? Is this some kind of a new disease? And then like magic, it just went away. And it went away because it was just a CIA experiment. In 1951, Allen Dulles becomes the director of the CIA, just like he planned to. And then there was nothing to keep him back. He told Sidney Gottlieb not only to do anything he wanted to do anything he felt he needed to do to continue these experiments, he gave him a virtually unlimited budget. So what did Sidney Gottlieb do? He continued experimenting on soldiers at Fort Detrick, but he also forged a secret relationship with Bellevue Hospital in New York to experiment there on mental patients. Now, what they told the doctors at Bellevue was that these experimental drugs, they didn't call it LSD, they didn't call it anything, they just called it an experimental drug, would ostensibly help mentally ill patients regain their sanity. Exactly the opposite happened. People went completely crazy. And people who were at Bellevue for temporary reasons like depression or anxiety actually lost their minds. There was one professional tennis player who checked himself in to Bellevue because of depression. He was supposed to be there for a couple of weeks. They used to call it rest and relaxation back then, when you can just check yourself into a mental hospital. He was given LSD on his first day there, but at 14 times the dosage that any of the previous patients had received. Within 24 hours, he was dead. So these experiments were really not much different than what the Nazis had been doing in the 1940s. Many years later, in the 1970s, when this information became public, Amnesty International said that the hypocrisy of this program was so shocking that future generations probably wouldn't even believe it.